He asks, is there an extraversion and IQ correlation? Yes, we have new data on this. This is very interesting. Extraversion and IQ are slightly negatively correlated, based on a massive meta-analysis that hasn't been published yet. I'd love it if the authors would go ahead and publish it. It was a master's thesis, but yes, they found that very slight negative correlations. I downloaded the thesis because it's relevant to a broader interest of mine, of what traits are going to get promoted under a regime of artificial selection, that is, designer babies, where people get to choose what their offspring are like. So, basically, what you're saying is that if people choose their offspring, they will choose very weakly stupidity. Oh, women overwhelmingly want highly extroverted offspring. They do not want highly intelligent offspring. So in terms of the genetic correlation between those traits, that will make it negative very quickly. Is it a genetic correlation? Yes, that's a standing prediction I have. Why? Because one of the reasons for the correlation is recent patterns of directional selection. A very intense directional selection, which has been operating on these populations for the last 200 years. We need to tease apart the variance components. And the problem with the correlation between IQ and extraversion is it's rather small. So you need a very, very large sample to really get at the shared genetic variance among components, which are largely independent of one another. And you can do power calculations to work out exactly how many twins you would need to throw at this. But there might be a simpler way of doing it. I actually have two data sets, some very good ones, in which there are polygenic scores for IQ and also phenotypic data on some of the big five. So, if extraversion is in there, you could do a really interesting study to see if you can use the polygenic scores for IQ to mediate any phenotypic associations between IQ and extraversion that we find in those data sets. Then we don't need the twins. And we can also increase the power to detect the effect, as the sample size is like 10,000 each for both of the studies. I was wondering about some research I found, which said that extraversion is part of the GFP, the general factor of personality, which, for people that aren't familiar, this is a measure of social effectiveness. High GFP people expend more effort, essentially. However, part of the GFP is extraversion. But I understand that extraversion is weakly associated with short-term sexual relationships, which has an inverse relationship with the GFP. Well, they would be related only insofar as extraversion is related to venturesomeness and dominance. So, this is one of Kevin MacDonald's ideas from way back, when he was still a personality psychologist studying the evolution of personality. He had this idea that the big five in humans should be made to look more like the big five in chimps, because there's a different big five in chimpanzees and gorillas. Instead of an extraversion and an agreeableness factor, they have a dominance factor, which captures dominance and venturesomeness. And they have a warmth and affiliative factor instead of an agreeableness factor. So what Kevin argued is, we should tweak the factor structures by imposing these oblomine rotations in order to recover these more evolutionarily informed big five. So, you still have the big five, it's just you forced certain things to become dominance, and you forced certain things to become agreeableness, and in doing so you've made them into slightly different things, which align a bit more with what we notice in primates. So, it would be interesting to see what happens to the GFP when you do those rotations. Does this flip the sign of the association between extraversion and the GFP? My long-standing prediction is yes, it should do. It should actually make the association with the GFP negative, because now instead of getting all the gregariousness in the extraversion factor, you're now forcing it into agreeableness as part of this affiliative factor. So all the gregariousness that would ordinarily rate you as high extraversion, because you'd like going out and interacting with people, but you don't necessarily like dominating them, trying to take control, you're not highly directive, to use John J. Ray's old term for his scale, from the 1970s on authoritarian behavior, which he called the directiveness measure. The best measure of authoritarian responding we have, by the way, is raised directiveness scale. So in other words, you're getting a directiveness scale, and you're putting that directiveness scale possibly in negative conjunction with the GFP. It'd be very interesting to see what that does to the factor structure.